Hey guys, what's going on? Blaine back for another Netflix review, and today I'm going to be talking about Passing. Passing is an American historical drama based on the novel of the same name, and tells the story of a black woman in 1920s Harlem named Irene Redfield, who unexpectedly reunites with a childhood friend of hers named Claire Bellew while out shopping for her family. Both women are able to pass as being white due to the lighter tone of their skin when compared to other African Americans, and thus experience less discrimination as a result. Their chance encounter, however, results in the resurrection of their friendship, which threatens to unravel their social identities. I had always wondered about the concept of passing without realizing that there was an actual name for the term. The idea of one person being able to pass from one race to another is pretty intriguing, especially when a historical context is applied to it. And in this movie's case, I enjoyed seeing the characters struggle to maintain their individually constructed identities and trying to keep them from falling apart. Both of them experience hardships that are unique to them, while also having some common ground between the two. The main character, Irene, who's played by Tessa Thompson, is a typical American citizen in the neighborhood. She's married to a loving husband, has a family with him, and is involved in her community. On top of this, she proudly identifies as being black, though she is able to pass as white when it's convenient for her to do so. I think Tessa did a great job in her performance. There's a fitting aura of sadness about her that follows her in just about every scene. Even though she is proud of her identity on the surface, she has deeply rooted insecurities about the outside world, largely owing to the public's perception of race at the time. She has to balance between staying involved in the black community, hosting events and such, while also passing as white in order to do everyday simple things that most white people take for granted, such as shopping for toys and driving around the city, among other things. She also avoids broaching the topic of racism to her children to prevent them from being hurt, which raises the ire of her husband Brian, who wants to ensure that their sons are made aware of the world around them so that they're better prepared to handle it. The pain her character has to endure on a daily basis is clearly evident every time she's on screen. She wants to celebrate her identity openly, but either has to do it under the cover of darkness or pose as someone else to feel some semblance of normalcy, and Tessa communicates the struggle brilliantly. Things become even more complicated when Claire, who's played by Ruth Negga, becomes more involved in her life. She is able to pass like Irene, but does it to a much more significant degree, going so far as to have her hair dyed lighter and even marrying a white man named John, who doesn't know her true identity. I found Ruth's performance to be extremely compelling. Her character has enjoyed the privileges of being white for so long that she's lost touch with her black identity. Even though she appears happy and easygoing on the surface, her yearning for a sense of belonging prevents her from being truly happy in her current state. The two characters go together like bread and butter. What makes the dynamic work so well between the two is the loneliness that they both share together. Irene is often left on her own once her husband Brian leaves for work and the kids go to school, while Claire is similarly left behind by John as he goes on his business trips. Their past history provides a Kickstarter of sorts for the relationship to follow, as they initially bond with each other, and then over the course of the story, conflicts arise as their true values come to light. I won't go far into what goes on between the two so as to avoid spoilers, but I appreciate the effort the filmmakers made into making both women's circumstances similar, but also different enough that it kept the story interesting. It demonstrates that many black people, including these two, have experienced racism, but they've all experienced it in various ways. The setting with which the movie takes place is brought to life in beautiful fashion. Being based on a novel written in the 1920s, I'm glad that it stayed faithful to the source material and didn't update the story with a more modern setting. I don't think the movie would have had the same impact with its themes and messages if it had done so. It almost feels like you're watching a Lost film at times. Characters drive the most primitive of vehicles even in New York City, wear suits and other manner of conservative clothing all the time, and have an eloquent manner of speaking that, if I'm being honest, took me a bit of time to get used to. These little details make its presentation much more authentic, as if we're actually seeing a product of the Roaring '20s right in front of us. An obvious homage to this element concerns the fact that this movie is filmed entirely in black and white. Normally I'm not a fan of the aesthetic, but in this case I thought it was well done. In my view, the black and white color scheme serves two purposes, the first of which is that it gives the movie a more historical feel to represent a time where color by itself was not visible in most forms of visual media. The other purpose for the black and white color scheme is that it helps blur the lines between the race, or races as the case may be, for the lead characters. It works to eliminate any preconceived notions the audience may have had about them, and and forces them to focus on the content of their character as well as the words they share that reveal said character. I think the lack of a use of color in this movie was a genius move. It allows us to see the characters for who they are as people while also recognizing the problems that they encounter as the story progresses. The lack of music was another thing that I felt added to the movie's lonely atmosphere. The occasional use of a jazz piano to reflect Irene's daily life becomes more effective once you realize that it's playing the same melody over and over again, signifying that she's repeatedly reliving the same day of her mundane existence. Outside of this, there's not much of a soundtrack, which I actually like as it adds more realism to Irene and Claire's struggles with racial identity. When characters argue with each other, there's no explosive score playing in the background to distract from the tone and emotion of the moment. It allows us to feel the characters' hardships raw and unfiltered. This all being said, the movie isn't without its flaws. I think its observations on race in general are excellent and quite timely in this day and age, even after almost a century of the original publishing of the source material, but I think it could have stood to add more meat to its bones, so to speak. And what I mean by that is I feel the movie is a bit on the shorter side for such a heavily themed story as this one. I haven't read the book, so I can't speak as to how much of the original source material was adapted to screen, but I can't help but feel that it glosses over things a bit too quickly. There's a few times in the movie, like I mentioned, where the subject of racism is brought up to Irene and Brian's kids, specifically with regards to lynchings. Just when the conversation starts to get interesting, Irene shuts it down and characters go back to doing what they were doing. I think the movie's PG-13 rating had something to do with how this aspect turned out. There's little detail given behind how the lynchings occurred, which makes sense because the kids shouldn't be traumatized, but it doesn't discuss them enough to have any real impact on them. It kind of feels sanitized in terms of how topics of racism are addressed, and I'm not saying what's there isn't meaningful, far from it. I wasn't even aware of the concept of passing until I watched this movie, and getting the chance to see how black people lived and grappled with this lifestyle, even if it was only a reenactment, really was enlightening. I just think it's a bit of a shame that the movie doesn't dive as deeply into its subject matter as it could have, and what is there doesn't quite feel complete. The only time racism is encountered throughout the whole movie is when Claire's wife John is on screen. And speaking of John, he was a character that I felt was severely underused. Don't get me wrong, I loved every moment that he was present in the movie. He adds just the right amount of tension needed to give more poignancy to the racial themes, as well as making us fear for Irene and Claire's safety more. But he only appears in a few scenes. He's not in the movie long enough to give a sense of where his racism is coming from beyond just simple ignorance. I kept wondering when he was going to show up again after his initial introduction, which could add suspense, but it takes too long to happen. There are other white characters as well, like Hugh Wentworth, who aren't necessarily racist, but also lacking in depth. Obviously, Irene and Claire are the stars of the show, so it makes sense that they're more fleshed out compared to others, but it would have been nice for the movie to have more for the supporting characters to do. Overall, Passing is a solid and sincere period drama that sheds light on a topic regarding racism not often discussed and closely examines the number of ways in which one constructs and maintains a social identity. If you enjoy period dramas, especially those with racial themes behind them, and you're looking for one that approaches them in a unique way, this movie definitely delivers. I would have preferred a more unfiltered perspective on its topics, but it is an adaptation, so the source material may have been presented the same way. Either way, I enjoyed learning about the concept of passing and empathizing with Irene and Claire's stories. It goes to show that inner turmoil and insecurities can be just as harmful to one's identity as the environment around them. Anyways guys, that's going to wrap up my review of Passing. Thanks for watching this video, I hope you enjoyed it, and as always stay tuned for the next part, where next time I review the Brazilian drama 7 Prisoners. Bye bye!